The next speaker we have is Cheryl Dahle. Cheryl Dahle is the CEO and co-founder of Flip Labs, and she's also an adjunct professor at Carnegie Mellon School of Design. Now, what Cheryl's going to talk about is transition design, and transition design is this new field of design that is really designed for managing the transitions of really complex systems. Sounds like healthcare. So let me welcome Cheryl Dahle up into the stage, and she will tell you all about this new field.
So I'm imagining right now, for those of you who read my bio and know anything about me, that you're cringing inside a little bit and thinking, who invited the fish lady? And what could fish possibly have to do with healthcare? And I will grant you that the global system of fishing on the surface might not seem to have a lot in common with healthcare. But I will also say that after 10 years of working on trying to design a transition where we pull back from overfishing globally, that systems are pretty much the same in their underlying nature. And the reason for that is that systems are made of human beings. And at some point, they get large enough, they get gnarly enough, and they get complex enough that they start producing outcomes that we're not that happy about, right? And that could be a result of bad design, or unjust design, or just an accumulation of unintended consequences. But these systems look the same because at our core, human beings in aggregate are the same. We have the same flaws, we have the same weaknesses, and the same blind spots. So we keep messing up in the same ways, no matter what system we're talking about. So I'm going to do a deep dive into the world of fisheries today, and pull out some lessons for you that I think can help you think about transition in the world of healthcare, and how you might think about a more ambitious and different role for design to play in that future. So fish. It is the largest globally traded commodity in the world, bigger than sugar, bigger than coffee. And there are big problems with the way the industry works and our relationship to the environment and to the ocean. Number one, we take too much. 90% of the world's fisheries are either overfished or they are fished at maximum capacity. We have already fished out 80% of our top predators in the food chain. So as you can see, we're moving from a world of lots of biodiversity in the past toward a future of nothing but jellyfish. We also lie about what we catch. There's a third of all seafood that's mislabeled. It either didn't come from where you think it came from, or it isn't what you think it is. Red snapper is only red snapper about 13% of the time. And mislabeling rates in sushi restaurants, those of you who love sushi, get ready to plug your ears, upwards of 75%. We also gather about 22 million metric tons of illegal seafood every year. So that's above and beyond what we've agreed the quota should be. And we catch it and move it into the legitimate supply chain. We also waste too much. 90 million metric tons in annual harvest of wild seafood, and an additional 27 million metric tons of stuff we catch and then throw away that's called bycatch. That's the stuff you catch by accident. So it's maybe turtles, or it could be dolphins. If you're fishing for shrimp, it could be coral, because the way we fish for shrimp is we essentially bulldoze the bottom of the ocean, and everything comes up with it. The bycatch rate for shrimp, 13.5 pounds of waste for every 1 pound of shrimp. So if you do one thing as a result of listening to this talk, stop eating wild shrimp. I first got involved in fish in 2008, working on a research project for a foundation. And we started by looking at all the existing solutions that were targeting overfishing in the space. And we looked for patterns, where there were clusters and where there were holes. And as it turned out, there were no solutions that were targeting the middle of the seafood supply chain, so the processors and the distributors. No one was talking to them. Everyone was either talking to fishermen about changing their behavior on the water or changing gear, or they were talking to retailers about carrying different fish. And the assumption was that by talking to both ends of the seafood supply chain, that the middle would just fall in line, and it wasn't happening. And so we sent anthropologists into the seafood supply chain to figure out, why is this getting stuck? And what can we learn about the motivations there that would help us potentially see some change? So we went to 8 locations around the world to watch people sell fish, and this is what we saw. This is at a location in North America, upwards of 100 million in sales. We show up at 5 a.m. because that's when fish get sold, and we watch the process. The sales manager prints out an Excel spreadsheet, hands it out to the salespeople, and emails it to some of the remote reps. And then they get on the phone, which is how fish is still sold in most places, and they call their customers and see what they want to order. Throughout the day, they're taking orders, but they're not calling back, and nothing's getting updated to the original Excel spreadsheet. And so pretty predictably, by the end of the day, you have some categories of fish that are oversold and some that are undersold. And it's the job of the sales manager to juggle the fish and figure out who's going to get what they actually ordered. And it looks something like this. He hops on the phone and says, "Hey, Bob, I know you ordered that haddock for tomorrow, but it turns out that the truck broke down, and so we don't have that. And instead, I'm going to have to send you some mackerel. It cooks up in a really similar fashion, and I'll knock $5 off the box." So Bob thinks he got a deal. He thinks he's been treated really well and had a high-touch customer experience. But this is what's really going on. First of all, demand is bullying supply. There are over 1,500 edible species of wild fish, and you and I want the same 5 fish every day, regardless of season or region, right? That means that supply and demand do not meet, and the crunch of that happens at the middle of the supply chain. So the way that the middle of the chain can deal with that is either by talking you into buying different fish, or they just take the skin off and ship it as what you asked for, because most chefs can't even tell the difference once the skin is off. Right? So that's how you get to this widespread fraud and mislabeling. The middle of the supply chain literally needs to commit fraud to stay in business. Second, the way fish is sold disguises scarcity. If you think red snapper is plentiful because you see it on restaurant menus everywhere, when actually it's not red snapper, you're not getting the feedback from the system that that's an endangered species. The fish's story is lost. If you as a consumer would like to spend maybe $2 more a pound for responsibly harvested fish, you can't do it because that information doesn't stay paired with the fish throughout the supply chain. And so you don't know when you're buying fish whether it is actually sustainable or not. And then finally, strong incentives exist for bad technology. For these middle-of-chain players, they don't want good technology that could show that fish into the facility does not look like fish going out of the facility, right? And their lack of embracing of technology means we can't even get to some enabling conditions necessary to be able to track sustainability globally and to be able to encourage that as a way of doing business. So we decided, based on this information, that we were going to track 2 things into the system. One was traceability systems, so new technology and better technology for the seafood supply chain. And second, story. These would be 2 levers of change. Story means that we were going to try to encourage the production of story and acceptance of story as a common part of buying fish. So right now, when you go and order fish somewhere, it's very likely many of the scenarios look like you having fish that's breaded and flaky and white, right? They don't even tell you what it is, let alone where it came from or how it was caught. And we've become accustomed to that. In the same way that we didn't used to think that cage-free eggs was a thing or grass-fed beef was a thing, right? But if we can acclimate to learning that a story should be part of our fish buying experience, and that should be part of it all the way through the chain, that could shake things up. We need, for data and for fish, to get married at the beginning of the supply chain and stay together all the way through. About a year after we had come up with those 2 levers as our points of change, I had started to join academia and ran across an academic paper by Donella Meadows, who's a systems theorist. And she posited that there are only 9 ways to intervene in systems. And this is the list, organized from least impactful to most impactful. And I won't review all of them, but I want to pull a couple to your attention. In the middle of the list, we have information flows. So that's exactly what we identified, right? So there's missing information at the transaction point of the fish. You don't know where it came from. You don't know whether it was caught responsibly. So the value of that as a practice cannot be present in the transaction, right? It can only be there once the information is flowing. Second, there's 2 issues there around distribution of power. Distribution of power over the rules, and then the power structure that creates the whole mindset behind the system. No matter what system you're working in, you will be dealing with power dynamics. And it typically looks like marginalized people not having a voice in the system and where it heads and what the rules look like. And it looks like people in power who are being served very well by the current status quo, thank you very much, trying to keep things the same. In our world, that meant processors and distributors who are pretty happy committing fraud or pretty happy moving illegal fish through their supply chain. And what we were trying to do is to say, all right, we're going to either drive them out of business because there will be so many better players that they'll be apparent, regulate them out of business, or provide incentives for them to change. So we founded a nonprofit called the Future of Fish in 2010. And the goal of Future of Fish was to pull together cohorts of entrepreneurs who were working on those two levers of story and traceability technology. It turned out, as I joined academia, that there's actually a framework that shows this theory of change being successful in other contexts, which was kind of handy 5 years after we did the work. There's a group of academics in Europe who looked at what they called socio-technological transformation. So it's changes in society that involve both behavior change as well as big, large-scale technology shifts. And they originally charted this looking at the transition in the United States from horse-drawn carriages to automobiles, which they showed taking over 60 years to occur. So it means that if you're going to pull off a big change like that, different things need to happen at different layers of a system. And the 3 layers that they named were, first of all, the niche layer at the bottom. That's individual activity, so that's your disruptive entrepreneurs. In the middle of the system is regime. That's where all the rules of the system live. So that's where corporations, governments, entities that create the day-to-day activities and the common ways of doing business live. And then finally, there's landscape, and that's the context for the whole system. That's the social mores, the beliefs, that's where mindset lives. And you can work on change at any one of these levels. It is the hardest to start at landscape. It's no mystery that mindset winds up being the most powerful lever, according to Danella, and it's the top layer here. It's very hard to start with mindset. And most nonprofits typically jump exactly there because they think you change mindset by preaching, right? You are a terrible person, you think terrible things about the ocean, you need to change your mind and think like we do, right? Which is not so effective. So our theory of change was that we would incubate these entrepreneurs and support them on their journey, and that their disruptive demonstration projects would show that the rules could change, and that actually it would be in more people's interest to behave the way they were behaving, and that eventually that could lead to changes in mindset. I'm going to give you 2 examples of the work that we did over 10 years and how it started to scale and get traction into that system. This is Barton Seaver. He is a professional chef. We met him about 10 years ago. And he had just closed a restaurant he had run in Washington, D.C. for many years called Hook. And the hook of Hook was that you come and you have fresh seafood that's locally caught and was also sustainable. And Barton is great at telling a story. And one of my favorite stories from his time as a restaurateur was the day he got a giant box of fish that he opened and didn't recognize, which is rare for Barton since he's written an anthology of fish. And so he called the distributor who got in touch with the fisherman, and the word came back. The fisherman went out on the water, and he had a bad day, and he didn't catch anything. So he sent Barton the bait. Barton had 50 pounds of something called flying fish, which is a little tiny fish, not much fillet on it, has a big fin that looks like a wing. And so he's like, all right, I got the bait. So he painstakingly filleted all that fish, and he created an appetizer, and he sent it out to the floor, and he said to the waitstaff, tell everyone it's the bait. Because if you're going to live in harmony with the world of nature, you eat what is provided, and you figure out how to make it tasty, right? You eat with what is supplied, not what you came demanding, right? So he sent it out on the floor, called it bait, and he sold out of that appetizer in 2 hours at $29 a plate. So our mission was to say, how can we take that kind of powerful story and scale it? How can we take that kind of powerful story and ability to influence behavior change with a delicious experience and turn that into something bigger? So we started with publishing. We helped him with his first cookbook. He has now published 7 cookbooks since we first began working together, including an anthology of seafood that our domestic fisheries produce. And then we looked at what might lend credibility to his voice, what could give some gravitas to him as a speaker and as someone of influence. So he made a connection at Harvard University, and we helped him design a position there at the School of Public Health, where he ran an institute that was focused on sustainable seafood. They helped convert the campus to being sustainably sourced for its seafood in the dining halls, and he started to lecture there as well. And then finally, we helped him develop a consulting practice, because Barton has an overlap of 3 areas of knowledge that rarely intersect in the world. Culinary knowledge, he knows how to cook things that wind up being tasty. Environmental knowledge, he can rival any marine scientist for his knowledge of what's sustainable and what isn't. And business knowledge, he knows how to run a successful restaurant. And you need all three of those things to actually do well by doing good and sourcing the right seafood. So he is now consulting with 4 of the largest institutional food service companies in the world. These are the companies that provide food to college dining halls or to hospitals, the places that offer food but don't prepare it fresh on site. These global companies are so large that Barton is now providing curriculum and recipes and instruction and purchasing guidelines for 90 countries, tens of thousands of chefs, and over 1 billion people served every year. Second is Tom Kraft. So Tom owns a distribution company in Hawaii selling fish. And he is a bit of a strange bird for the fish industry because his background is as a CPA. He started out as an auditor, and he would go into different industries and audit their books. But because of that, he actually knew how other industries worked. And so when he landed in seafood, he said, "This is bonkers. I cannot close my books until a month or 2 out because I don't have real-time data. Because I'm not actually tracking the fish and I don't have information, I can't run my business with that information." So he said, "I'm going to make my own." He built a homegrown system tracing the journey of the fish through his processing facility, from the time it came to the door and became fillets or other value-added products, all the way back to the boat that it came in on. As a result of the system that he built, he wound up saving 80% in overtime costs for labor. He wound up cutting 2 to 3% off his cost of goods, and he increased the shelf life of the fish he was selling by about 2 weeks. Because if you can actually monitor whether the people in the factory are taking the fish on the top of the pile, which is easier to reach, or going to the bottom to the one that came into the factory first, you can lengthen the freshness of your fish. Right? So we helped him take that technology and spin it off into a new company that now services the seafood industry. And they have dozens of clients that work in various levels of the supply chain using this tool. So, but the scale of Tom didn't happen through his individual company. It happened because of what his company was able to prove was possible. First of all, he made it clear that companies could follow regulations around traceability and technology if they desired to. He also made it clear that you could make more money through data-driven management than you could by committing fraud. And so things started to get shaken up at the regime level. Right? So a year ago, the United States government started requiring that for countries that have high levels of risk for fraud and mislabeling, they have to provide traceability technology. That's important because we import 90% of our seafood here in the US. The second thing that happened was the consortium of nonprofits that run what are called fishery improvement projects. So these are ways for fisheries in developing nations to become certified as delivering sustainable seafood. In order to become part of a fishery improvement project, it's a requirement now that you have traceability technology as part of your initiative. Right? And then a year ago, Future of Fish helped Tom and a bunch of his colleagues launch a trade organization for seafood vendors that are technology vendors. There weren't enough of them when we started in 2010 to even throw a stick at, and now there's enough that they need their own organization to collaborate pre-competitively. So Tom and Barton are not going to single-handedly revolutionize the world of fish, but they are important design initiatives along the way that are pushing us toward the milestones that we created. Transition design means looking forward in the future and creating a destination and a direction that envisions what a future could look like. And for us, it meant that fish is no longer a commodity or no longer treated as one. It's part of an ecosystem that we value. Right? And backcasting from that future, you can identify what are the milestones to get to that place. And in between the milestones are design projects. Some of you are currently working on projects that look like some of these interstitial design points, right? Where you're moving your system toward an outcome that you eventually want to see happen. This is not something that is centrally guided, and often it doesn't even look that collaborative, right? The first couple of years that Future of Fish operated in the space, all of the nonprofit partners that were in the space hated our guts because we came in and we named that technology was an important part of the problem. And none of them had experience in technology or in implementing it in supply chains. So we were basically moving their cheese, which they did not appreciate. So I've got 3 bits of advice that's a little counterintuitive to take away. First is make the problem bigger. We often think when we look at complex systems that what we want to do is find what's the biggest area of the problem, or what's the most effective solution, and dig in there, or somehow simplify, because it's so overwhelming to face all of it at once. And I'd say that it's the wrong instinct, because what we found is that if you actually think bigger and figure out not only what is your problem, but what are the problems of other tangential systems that you could help solve, it gives you leverage. What I mean by that is that systems do not have the hard boundaries that we think of. Those are artificial, right? If you're talking about early childhood education, pretty soon you're talking about what a child ate for breakfast before he or she goes to school, which means you're actually talking about food systems too, right? We like to think in silos, and we like to put things in buckets of here's where one system starts and here's where another ends. But it's actually really powerful to see where all the bleeding together happens. Barton reached out to some hospitals and offered to write nutrition guides for them that helped them give patients they were discharging great advice on how to eat healthy. And oh, by the way, there was also great information there about sustainable seafood. So he got a broader audience, and they got their problem solved. Right? When we work in developing countries, one of the things we're trying to do is reduce the amount of effort on the water, which means, in many cases, fewer fishermen around. Right? We got to figure out something for those fishermen to do. And so we work with economic development groups in the region to look at where are they trying to seed new businesses and new opportunities and alternative livelihoods. Right? If you look beyond just your own problem, you will find someone with a similar need and a different problem. Second is rewrite the role of designers. This has already been happening as we've progressed from designing objects to designing services to experiences to now this emergent space of transition design. As we've moved, it's gotten more complex and abstract, and the need for designers to change their role has become more important. In transition design, designers are not the source of ideas at all. In fact, what you're doing is curating an environment so other people can come up with better ideas, right? The participants are the ones who come up with ideas. They're not the users of the system, so it's not the consumers buying fish who are coming up with ideas, but it's the leaders in the system who are potentially working in nonprofits that shape the system. It's people who are government leaders. It's people who are entrepreneurs, like Barton and Tom, right? So it's people who are shaping the regime level, people who are experimenting on the niche level. And they will come up with better ideas if what you curate for them are new insights they'd never seen before, new partners they'd never considered working with, and new ways of supporting what they're implementing. And finally, this is the hardest one, which is believe in possibility. It's really difficult to work in a system that's really messed up and come in day after day knowing that you're not going to see anything tangible for maybe 5 or 10 years in the work. But somebody has to keep the faith. And somebody has to be finding people like Barton and Tom and believing in them and their disruptive potential, even when they're not believing in themselves. As I look around this room, I'm sure that some of you are working on some of these disruptive types of projects that are headed toward a transitional future that you may or may not have defined. It may or may not be collaborative, but you are moving the needle. And your job is to find these positive outliers and believe that they can drive change. I believe in the possibilities that you're trying to curate around healthcare, because I think we've all had a chance to see what it can be in its best version. Great healthcare can be courageous, and it can be heroic and miraculous and compassionate, right? And that's a possibility we want to see come to fruition. And I'll also say that as someone who's worked on incremental change over a long period of time, I'm aware that you very often do not receive credit or gratitude for the work you're doing in that incremental journey. And so what I want to leave you with is thank you for the work that you're doing, and thank you for the way that you are changing the world. It's been a pleasure to speak to you this afternoon. Thanks.